Welcome to the show.
What show is that?
Welcome to the show.
I'm trying to connect now.
Unable to connect. If you have an internet connection, go fuck yourself, because it doesn't matter. Salvete discipuli et discipuli, it's me again, Miles Crisp, with the 8th episode of Divergent History, and it's Friday, May 31st, 2013. When I woke up this morning, early, I decided to listen to some Coast to Coast AM before settling down to compile notes for tonight's show. And as I was in the kitchen making something to eat, I found that Graham Hancock had been on the past Tuesday night show, which to you guys I guess would have been Wednesday morning. He has a new book coming out called War God. It's a fictionalized version of what transpired when the Spanish invaded what's now Mexico. Basically, they were conquering the Aztecs. He's done a lot of research, as Hancock usually does for those who are already acquainted with his work. He did Fingerprints of the Gods. His last fictional book really kicked ass. It was called Entangled. I can't recommend that book more highly. It's just great. Anyway, he's offering apparently up to midnight tonight, British summertime, in 2 hours. If you pre-order or order his book, you can apparently send him an email on his website, and he'll sign a book plate and mail it to you that you could put into the book. And so, that's my one and only advertisement I've ever done. I just wanted to say that. I really thought Entangled kicked ass. It's about telepathic, telekinetic Neanderthals that could travel through time. It's pretty cool. This new one, I think, is just going to be about crazy Aztecs. And I'm getting to that. But what's weird is, when I'm starting the show off talking about this, is that I had planned to talk about Hernan Cortez tonight anyways. What I know of the event comes from the greatest class I've ever had, and I've probably mentioned this before, the one that I had with Dr. Jim McClellan, the history of the Native American Indian. As far as I know, this class is still being taught at Northern Virginia Community College, but I'm not sure if McClellan still actually teaches it himself personally anymore. But I spent many hours trying to figure out all the key players and locations in order to explain it better to you. I don't want you to think that I only know this stuff from this one particular class. Rather, the class was like an index to an encyclopedia. It allowed me to branch out in a highly constructive manner, as opposed to fumbling around in the dark, the way most research is done if you don't have anybody to guide you. Similar for me was the way the book Before Civilization, The Radiocarbon Revolution, Prehistoric Europe by Colin Renfrew was after I graduated from high school. The full subtitle of that book, by the way, is The Radiocarbon Revolution and Prehistoric Europe by Colin Renfrew, How Archaeological History Has Been Pushed Backward in Time by Recent Drastic Revision of Radiocarbon Dates, which now trace the megalithic cultures of Europe to beginnings earlier than and independent of Egypt and Mycenae. Or Mycenae, if you want to say it that way. And of course, when I was 18, standing in the library, that was... those last 18 words really got my attention. But that book's 40 years old now, and it was published in 1973. I spent almost as much time unlearning things, which I have since changed in the science since 1973, as I have spent time learning those antiquated facts in the first place. And this is why that's good. This is why having a good teacher is so vital. But remember always that I am no teacher, at least not yet. I am more like a student who has been placed in charge of substituting for the professor, as opposed to actually being a teacher myself. I'm learning as I go here, and I'm not going to come down on you guys as being some sort of know-it-all in everything I discuss, because I'm not that. But I do know quite a bit. Having listened to talk radio now for the past 3 years or so quite heavily, because of my previous line of gainful employment allowed for such things, I've realized that there's a dearth of wisdom. But more to the point, there's a dearth of practical, sound, critical thinking. It's for these reasons that I come to you more or less every Friday for 2 hours to try my hand at lecturing for the betterment of all who listen. When I say something wrong or misrepresent something, like last week when I underestimated the size of the waters between the Isle of Anglesey and the mainland of Wales, Bob here corrected me. And I want that to happen more often. After all, when I'm in the classroom, I'm the kind of student who never shuts up. I pry and probe for weaknesses in the professor's arguments. Once I identify a few, I bide my time and pounce when I calculate the timing to be both in my favor. Usually I am able to piss them off to a high degree, yet still get a good grade, meaning an A. Other times it deteriorates into a stalemate and I end up getting a C. All that being said, this show is going to be done in segments. I'm not exactly sure how long each segment will last, but I want to start with the Aztecs and Cortez. Then I'd like to cover some of the Roman history, this time of a more anthropological, sociological nature. I'll discuss the Roman family, how it functioned in their society, and what it was like to live within it. Also, I'm going to talk about what it was like for women in ancient Rome. And then I'm going to talk a bit of geology regarding the famous Year Without a Summer, which occurred in 1816, a year after Mount Tambora exploded in the largest known volcanic eruption in 1,300 years up to that time. Then I'm going to move on to a few brief topics in linguistics. That's not going to take very long, although I do have some funny anecdotes. I am weakest when it comes to linguistics, but the topics I plan to discuss are so basic and important, I think I should at least give them a shot. Essentially, I just want to briefly acquaint you guys with some key concepts, namely the differences between dialects, pidgin languages, and Creole languages. At the end of each of these topics, I plan on taking questions, if anybody has any, either from the chat room or from whoever's hanging on the line here on Skype. And I'm assuming each of these parts is, for the first two are probably each going to be at least 45 minutes, and we'll see how it goes from there. So, part 1, the spread of the Chichimecs, the start of the Aztecs. And just to help you with what the hell I'm saying, Chichimecs is Chichimecs. And beginning here with the cast of characters and locations, the Chichimecs are a semi-nomadic barbarian peoples who came into the Valley of Mexico about 500 AD. The Valley of Mexico is essentially the center of Mexico around where now today you have Mexico City. The Chichimecs were an extremely violent people, and the name actually means those descended from dogs. And I believe that's in one of the languages of the people they conquered, but I'll have to get back to you on that point. I'm not sure. I am certain of the translation, just not of what language it's from exactly. Then you have the Mexicas, Mexicas. The X in this part of the world is pronounced SH. Apparently, when the Spanish came into Mesoamerica, the SH sound was predominant, but in Spanish, I guess you can't write that, so they just used an X. So, Mexicas, it's not Mexicas or whatever. Anyway, the Mexicas are also known as the Tenoches, and to us as the Aztecs. The Mexicas were one group of many that were the Chichimecs. The Chichimecs are basically like barbarians from northern Europe, only here we're talking about in Mexico. There were various, you have Ostrogoths and Visigoths. Well, here you have Mexicas and Toltecs and other groups that are still considered Chichimecs. The next one, the Toltecs. They were dominant in the Valley of Mexico from about 900 AD to 1156. They spoke a similar language in the same language family as that of the Aztecs language, but they were an earlier wave of Chichimecs into the Valley of Mexico. Basically, they're like distant cousins to the Aztecs, I guess you could say. The classic period in the Valley of Mexico. This is roughly from about 250 AD, the rise of Teotihuacan, to the fall of that city by the Chichimecs in AD 850. By 900 AD, the Chichimec invaders basically became the Toltecs with their empire of the same name. This signals the end of the classic period in the Valley of Mexico. So the classic period is the city of Teotihuacan from 250 to 850. After that, after 900 or so, when the Toltecs had taken control, that's the end of the classic period, and they usually call that the epi-classical period or the post-classical period. Teotihuacanos, or the people from the city Teotihuacan. There is no direct link between those people and the Toltecs. There is a direct link between the Toltecs and the modern people of Mexico. What happened to the Teotihuacanos, nobody knows. They were either assimilated through intermarriage into the Toltec culture, or they were exterminated. We don't know. Mixcoatl, Mixcoatl. He's the Toltec empire builder. He expanded their domain considerably in the mid-900s. And he's the father of Seacatl-Peltzin-Quetzalcoatl. Yeah, that's the man's name. I'll spell it. The first word is C-E, then A-C-A-T-L, then T-O-P-I-L-T-Z-I-N, and then Quetzalcoatl, Q-U-E-T-Z-A-L-C-O-A-T-L. Seacatl-Peltzin-Quetzalcoatl. Say that to somebody in a bar if you don't want to ever have to talk to them. They'll think you're having a stroke. He is the son of this assassinated ruler, Mixcoatl, and he was educated by the priests in the cult of Quetzalcoatl. That was the religion of the people, the Teotihuacanos, who were overwhelmed by the Chichimecs. So he was essentially educated in the more ancient ways of the people whom his ancestors invaded from the classical period. The Toltecs, like I said, are the descendants of these Chichimecs. When he was in charge, he killed the guys who killed his father. Makes sense. He also tried to get people to plant more crops and not stop having human sacrifice, but he was discouraging it. He tried to put his people on a more peaceful path, and that, of course, led to civil war. He left from the coast of Veracruz, on the Caribbean coast of eastern Mexico, around the year 999 AD, and he promised that he would return on that same date in their calendar when it came back up. And I'm not even going to try to explain how their double calendar system worked, but I think it was something like every 80 or so years they would kind of reach what we would think of as a century, but anyway. Tenochtitlan is the Aztec capital, which was built in 1325 and basically reigned independent until Cortez took it over in 1521, and it's built on Lake Texcoco, Texcoco. Lake Texcoco. Not much left of it. Right now it's been filled in and is present-day modern Mexico City. The southern part of it, the bit of the lake that still exists today, I think, is called Xochimilco. 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 I'm not totally certain about that part. And then you have Chichen Itza. It's a Mayan city where Quetzalcoatl was also venerated, but they called him Kukulkan. And the full origin of that idea of Quetzalcoatl Kukulkan is not entirely clear to me. He did represent peace, and he was a feathered serpent. He is also this man, Seacatl-Peltzin-Quetzalcoatl, who happened to be a Toltec guy. Then he's the guy who left and said he was going to come back. Now, there's a myth in their mythology of a Quetzalcoatl that left and said he would come back, but that was supposed to be some bearded, tall, white guy. And I'm assuming Seacatl-Peltzin-Quetzalcoatl didn't fit that bill, so that's, I guess I'm not entirely certain on how that all works. They have these things called chinampas, Chinampas. They're essentially raised islands surrounded by shallow canals / organized swamps where crops were grown, and within the water fish were raised. Mud from the bottom of these canals would be dredged and used as a fertilizer for the crops on the chinampas. And I think there was even a kind of fish they raised in the canals, but I'm not certain. There was also a kind of seaweed they basically cultivated in these canals, which helped feed the fish. But I'll have to get back to you on that point. The same method of construction was used to build these islands that the Aztecs used in the city of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was built essentially in a swamp. The building technique was borrowed from the Toltecs that I think borrowed from the Teotihuacanos. So it's kind of like the the Romans borrowing road building, arches, aqueducts, and things like that from the Etruscans. Then you have Xochicalco, Xochicaco. Let me start over. Xochicalco, Xochicalco. And that was a fortress city in the late Classic period in the valley of Morelos. That was the center of the cult of Quetzalcoatl, but it was not overrun by Chichimex. It remained that way because it was on a high mountain ridge where you could see people coming from a long way away on either side of this valley. It's a Classic Age city about 50 miles southwest of Mexico City, and it's one of the few places that survived the onslaught of Chichimex from about 800 to 850 AD. Huitzilopochtli. Do you really want me to spell that one? Huitzzelopchtli. Huitzilopochtli was an Aztec, Mexica, Tenochti's patron deity and protector. Usually took the form of a hummingbird, but not necessarily, and it liked human blood. Tezcatlipoca. There you go. Toltec god of death, darkness, and nasty things. Tula, principal Toltec city. Nahuatl. Language family of the Aztecs and Toltecs. You have the Venus Wars. When their two calendar systems came together, there's a 5-to-8 ratio between Earth years and Venus years, I don't remember which is which, they would have ritual warfare. There was a cult of the Jaguars and a cult of the Eagles, and they would dress up as Jaguars and Eagles, and I don't think they'd actually kill each other, but they'd have some sort of ritual fight, and then at the end of the day, they'd take captives and sacrifice them on top of the pyramids, because apparently Huitzilopochtli preferred human blood as his favorite food, and even beyond that, he preferred it to be the blood of a still beating human heart. So, yeah. And Hernan Cortez, leader of the Spanish forces in 1519. Montezuma, the second to last Aztec speaker, and Cuauhtemoc, the last Aztec speaker. I'm not even going to try to spell that one for you guys. Now, the spread of the Chichimex. The city of Teotihuacan was dominant throughout the Classic period in the Valley of Mexico. It was where the Teotihuacano people originated. We know of no direct link between any of these people and those who came after. They were either assimilated or made extinct. As far as we know, the Chichimex came from the northern plateaus of Mexico, states like Chihuahua. There was a drought about 800 AD that forced a lot of people to migrate across these mountains south and attack cities they knew were down there in the Valley of Mexico. If you remember the episode I had about the Hohokam and Pima Amerindians, I talked about a drought they experienced around the 800s. And by the way, that's the latter half of episode 3 from March 29th, 2013. This is that same drought, I believe. What in Europe historians refer to as the medieval warm period, that is from about 900 to 1200, there was a drought here in the southwest of the United States and northern mountains and high desert plateaus of northern Mexico. So these Chichimex liked the area once they came down into it and ended up settling there. After Sayacatl, Tolpiltz, and Quetzalcoatl left, they kept spreading into the Valley of Mexico. By 1156, the Teotihuacanos were wiped out, and in this period, new waves of Chichimex started coming in, one group of which was called the Mexicas. Remember, Mexicas and Aztecs are the same thing. Also called the Tenochti's, we know of them as the Aztecs. They arrived in 1168 in the Valley of Mexico, after having crossed those northern mountains to the northwest. They were a landless, wandering tribe, considered to be barbarians by all of those in central Mexico. And you think about it like this. Think of Hell's Angels, the renegade biker group coming into a town. Like in some old movie from the 50s that probably starred Marlon Brando. Only in this case, it's Hell's Indians. Everybody hated these guys. There weren't many of them, only a few thousand, but they were ferocious. They were often hired as mercenaries because they seemed to have no fear of death whatsoever, and had a reputation for brutality which preceded them wherever they went. And like I said earlier, their principal deity was Huitzilopochtli, and it's said that god led them to their land and prosperity in the form of a hummingbird, some sort of enchantment. This is where the Mexican symbol of the eagle with the snake in its talons on the cactus over a swamp comes from. Shortly after 1300, they were employed by a ruler of Culhuacan named Coxcoxtli. It's Coxcoxtli, Coxcoxtli. He hired the Aztecs to fight some of his enemies in Xochimilco, that bottom part of that lake, near what's now Mexico City. He told them to go fight these people and to return with 8,000 captives that he could use as slaves. Then they came back, the Aztecs that is, after the war was over, dragging behind them big cotton bags in the Coxcoxtli's palace. Coxcoxtli asked, where were all the captives? They said that they had done one better than that, and they opened up the bags and poured out over 8,000 ears. So Coxcoxtli was naturally a bit disgusted by this, and decided that perhaps the Aztecs were not a reliable, rational ally. So he said that, you know what? I don't need you guys to fight for me anymore. You're free to go. And how about I give you this piece of land? Yeah, it's a swamp. I don't really want it. I don't really want you, so please leave. And to cement this relationship of peace, the Aztecs suggested that they marry his daughter. So Coxcoxtli, realizing that would probably be a good way to hopefully keep them from ever attacking him, he gave them his daughter. All right, go ahead. And they set a date for a ceremony shortly in the future. Coxcoxtli naively assumed that there would be a wedding at that date. When the time arrived, and he showed up for the ceremony, he was actually absolutely shocked at what he saw. As William Bradley writes, wishing to flatter Coxcoxtli with the highest honor they could think of, the Aztecs had actually sacrificed his daughter and invited Coxcoxtli to watch the solemn climax of the ceremony in which the priest was dancing in the young girl's skin. To their amazement, Coxcoxtli was enraged. I mean, say what you want about the Spanish Inquisition, they were basically just torturing political prisoners. Don't get me wrong, it's horrible, but these Aztec guys, man, they took this to a whole other level. Coxcoxtli sent out his army and chased the Aztecs deep into the swamps. That's why they had to settle on some islands roughly in the middle of this lake swamp region. That is where they built their capital city, Tenochtitlan, and they began construction of that city in 1325. Since the island was small, they had to expand it in order to create a large city. They took cone-shaped baskets, and like I said, the lake was pretty shallow. They lined them up in rows, dropped them down the point of the cone facing down into the mud, and came along with their canoes and filled them up with earth. And once these were all full of dirt, they planted trees along the edges so that the roots would grow down along the side and into the ground and anchor these cones into position. These were also what I was calling chinampas, these sort of man-made islands. Excuse me. They also built their city on these same islands. By 1400, they were becoming quite a powerful city-state. They had a three-city kind of triumvirate alliance thing going on, but by 1500, the Aztecs had overcome their two partners. There was only one city they didn't take over. They ruled over about 11 million people in the Valley of Mexico by 1500. They believed it was their god, Huitzilopochtli, who led them to this. Since he had all promised them, what he had all promised them had come true, the Aztecs wanted to venerate him even more. He was also their sun god, and they saw him rise every morning and fight away the darkness and his jealous brothers and sisters, the stars and the moon. And by midday, he got to the top of the sky and he became tired, and that's when he would slowly recede back, and then this struggle would begin all over again. And were this to stop, all of life on Earth would perish. So they believed that he needed to be nourished. They were afraid that the sun god wouldn't make it back the next morning. They thought that he would become really hungry, and like I said, his favorite food was blood from a still-beating human heart, especially when things were going bad. When they do the sacrifice, they would use an obsidian blade to come under the ribs and remove the heart from the chest, and then squeeze the blood out onto a type of paper that they would then burn, and the smoke would go up, and that's how the deity was nourished. Who wouldn't dare do this? It would be the end of all life if you didn't have these sacrifices. So the Aztec believed that when a warrior died in battle, or a woman died in childbirth, or someone was sacrificed, they went to the highest point in heaven. They had a hierarchical view of heaven. If you just die of old age, then you have a bunch of trials and tribulations to have to go through in the afterlife. And they had this connection between warfare and religion. About 20,000 people a year generally were sacrificed. This out of a controlled population of about 11 million. Some of them were captives, some of them were volunteers. Many, the Maya, back in the jungles further east in the Yucatan before the Aztecs, preferred royal blood, and it was seen as nourishing the earth, not the sun. But the Aztecs took this to a completely different level. And I'm sorry, but I gotta go get something real quick. Can I have about 3 minutes? Little break? Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, the Aztecs, at this point, they had conscripted perhaps hundreds of thousands of people from the various cities they had conquered into their army. No one city was strong enough. Think city-states, kind of like Athens and Corinth and Sparta and I can't name another Greek city off the top of my head, but anyway, they're kind of independent political entities with their own armies and their own kings and their own little kingdoms. But no one of them was strong enough to rise up against the Aztecs. This is why when Cortez came in, he was able to do what he did relatively easily. If someone shows up who says that they could take these guys out, wouldn't you want to join them? The Aztecs were not... Excuse me. The Aztecs were not like the Inca at all. The Inca in South America administered their people, made sure they had food and clothes and all that good stuff. The Aztecs didn't care about that. They just wanted submission and tribute. Tribute probably in the form of food, women, and people for sacrifice, and men for the army. They're kind of like Nazis. By about the year 1450, there were 4 years of weird weather. The crops failed, and the priests said that the sun god wasn't getting enough nourishment. They increased the number of sacrifices. Like I said, they had been doing about 20,000 a year, and things went back to normal. So now they saw that there was a direct connection between the amount of sacrifices and the bounty of the harvest. In 1486, they built the biggest temple in Mesoamerica. When they dedicated it, they sacrificed about 80,000 people in one ceremony. The ceremony lasted about 3 or 4 days. People lined up in 4 directions around this pyramid on the streets to be sacrificed. The streets ran with blood. It apparently worked. The next year's harvest was better than ever. And it almost makes me wonder if that amount of blood going into that swamp with those Chinampos islands where they were growing their food somehow was a morbid kind of fertilizer. I don't think it was. But anyway, it makes me think that. The city of Tenochtitlan was becoming quite huge at this point. It had over 1,000 temples. It had hundreds of miles of causeways and interconnecting bridges and canals that connected the various islands and these islands to the mainland. They had a 3-mile-long aqueduct to bring fresh water into the city. The leader was called the Speaker, and the palace of the Speaker had 3,000 servants to maintain it. The presidential palace was built on this site. The presidential palace of the President of Mexico today is built on this very site. There were botanical gardens. It's kind of like Venice with all of the canals and bridges. They had zoos because the Aztecs had a thing for wild animals. 4 large marketplaces or plazas, one of which was the largest market in the world at this point, and they employed 1,000 people just to sweep the streets. The Spanish were completely amazed when they saw this. Tenochtitlan had 60,000 civil buildings and a population of about 300,000 people. London at the same time had 120,000 people. So over twice the population of London in the same time at the year 1500. They governed themselves in a fairly democratic manner. They had 20 districts. Each had a council. These councils would elect, I guess, one of their own to a national council, and this body of 20 made all the laws. 4 of them were called electors, who nominated someone to be speaker. Speaker being the highest office. It was not hereditary, but the person was supposed to be of Toltec blood, because they had that connection with Culhuacan, the city of that first guy that hired them to get the 8,000 captives, and they brought back 8,000 years. He was Toltec, so they had this sort of symbolic connection, I guess, to the Toltec. And there was also a deputy speaker. The speaker could be replaced at any time by the council. He was in charge of warfare and foreign policy. The deputy speaker was basically an administrator. the more, I guess, just handling the more mundane tasks that the Speaker didn't feel like being bothered with. From my experience, that probably means that the Deputy Speaker did most of the work. Montezuma was the Speaker when Cortez arrived. He was originally trained for the priesthood, though. It wasn't really a great choice for Speaker. He was a bit too religious. Now, starting in the year 1505, there was a series of disasters. First, a bolt of lightning came out of a clear blue sky, which there is a scientific explanation for, but anyway. It set the top of one of the temples on fire on top of one of the pyramids. That was kind of freaky. Then a wind came at such an angle that it whipped all of the waters of Lake Texcoco into a boil, what appeared to be boiling water. Then, one night, there was a woman reported to be walking around the streets screaming about the fate of the city. Finally, a bird was found by a group of fishermen in the lake that had iridescent feathers. They took the bird to Montezuma, and he is said to have seen what looked like sails, like on a ship, in the feathers. By the way, he had never seen a ship with sails on it before, so how they could make that analogy is very confusing to me. They sacrificed the bird, but learned nothing more from it. He asked the priests if they could explain all of these weird events. They held a conference and reached a conclusion. They said that it means Quetzalcoatl is about to return. And if we're correct, it'll be in 14 years, the year 1519. That's when his birthday comes back up in our crazy calendar system. So they spent those years preparing for the arrival of Quetzalcoatl. Cortez arrives in Mexico. In 1519, Hernan Cortez arrives in Mexico. Remember that Quetzalcoatl is said to be the feathered serpent? And Cortez had feathers on his helmet and wore bronze and steel armor. He and his men were on horses, which the Aztecs had never seen before. So the initial reports that came to Montezuma were of two-headed creatures coming to shore covered in gold and silver with feathers on their heads. Close enough, right? These two-headed creatures had 4 legs, 2 arms, and 2 heads. The priest said, yeah, that's what we expected. It's Quetzalcoatl, all right. Cortez made contact with the Totemecs. They had recently come under Aztec rule and didn't like it. Cortez executed the messengers sent by Montezuma. In this time, Montezuma sent out people to go say hello, and Cortez killed them. The Totemecs were horrified because they expected the Aztecs to come back for reprisal. At this point, the Totemecs basically had no choice but to join Cortez. Of course, they hated the Aztecs anyway. They escorted him to one city that never came under Aztec rule and cobbled together people who hated the Aztecs equally. He was allowed to march into Tenochtitlan without a fight. Montezuma still thought he might be Quetzalcoatl. The first night Cortez was there, the servants of Montezuma realized that he wasn't Quetzalcoatl after the way he and his men reacted when they saw the gold. After a while, they finally realized he wasn't Quetzalcoatl and replaced Montezuma. That speaker drove the Spanish out. They tried to take 18 tons of gold with them, and a lot of the men actually drowned in the shallow waters trying to escape. Cortez retreated to the coast, but he left smallpox in his wake. When he came back with his hundreds of thousands of allies, the people of the city were suffering from a massive smallpox epidemic. It took 85 days of house-to-house fighting to subdue the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. 225,000 Aztec, almost the whole population, fought to the death. It fell to the Spanish on August 13th, 1521. The Spanish set themselves up as a ruling class, using the Indians as laborers. They imposed Catholicism on them, which of course sort of morphed into a more pagan version of Catholicism based on the gods that the people were already worshiping. In 1821, Mexico became independent from Spain, and in 1902, Mexico had a revolution establishing an elected government. So that's the end of part 1. Did anybody have any questions so far? Dead air. Nope.
No, I'm good, Miles. I'm soaking it all up, mate.
Okay. Now, the second thing I was going to talk about tonight is, I see that's 40 minutes, and that's not bad. I'm trying to figure out how to time these things. So, second thing I'm going to talk about is the Roman family and women in ancient Rome. It's kind of hard to, might as well do both at the same time. I was just going to talk about women, but I figured we could do both. So, the Roman family. By the way, the names I'm going to mention here, I'm going to go ahead and pronounce in Latin as close as I can. I don't feel like trying with English pronunciations of them. So the first thing is you have a pater familias, which means the father of the family. He had complete legal control over all the members of the family and all of their property. You have the word familia. Broad term, just as it is in our society today, it means anybody who you dealt with a lot. Slaves would have been considered family. People that you work with would have been considered family. But what we're discussing here is the nuclear family: father, mother, aunt, sister, brother, grandpa, that kind of thing. Domus, house, or otherwise used to mean household in the sense that we're using it here where it's referring to a nuclear family. Remember that Monty Python scene? Romane seant domus, and John Cleese comes over and, it's like, wait a minute. Yeah, if you don't remember the scene, I'm not... Anyway. Land ownership was fundamental in the ancient world. So fundamental that the family was devoted to protecting it at all costs. Certainly at the cost of women being able to leave the house very much. Sons were very important for working the land, and the fidelity of the women was paramount. If you had a wife or daughter have a child with another man, one that wasn't chosen by you, that man would have a stake in the family's land holdings because what is his son's property is his property, you see. Families would want to hold on to their land and expand it as much as they could. This was more important for the richer members of society. And as usual, we know more about the upper classes than about the lower classes, as far as family relationships and as far as anything is concerned, because they're the ones that wrote things down. But we assume the lower classes were considerably different, but we don't know that much about them. The upper class Roman family had an emphasis placed on the ancestors, the maiores, similar to the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, or the way the old people did it. They basically worshipped their ancestors. Since it would have been these ancestors who established the land and position in the state and society that the family was enjoying, the ancestors were incredibly important. They had shrines to these ancestors, waxen death masks called imagines. They'd be taken out in funerals and worn by actors who had similar body shapes and sizes, so they could basically be present during a funeral. And the masks were taken of impressions of the face of the man when he died, and then molded into a wax thing that would, be an image of the guy's face. These were put up on shrines in the house for generations. Kind of uniquely Roman thing to do. Excuse me. So, the upper class marriages were probably never based on love. It was political or economic, selling land or sealing political alliances. Basically, they were arranged marriages. Children would be betrothed to each other and have the wedding take place years after once they had come of age. Many times the men would be much older than the girls, who could be as young as 14 or 15. Oftentimes the man would be in his mid-30s. That's roughly the age of accomplishment for a Roman senator or high-class nobleman. That would change the nature of a marriage, being married to a teenager. That's why concordia was the ideal in Roman marriage. Basically, that means getting along, harmony. That was a feature praised in gravestones all over the land to mark successful marriages. And this is one of the few things I could say that spanned all of Roman history. I dare say even into the early Christian era. It was still this concept of, oh, could you two actually get along until one of you died? Okay, good for you. That's a good marriage. It's kind of a low standard, but I guess it worked for them. And anyway, families were hierarchical. No surprise there. It's the Romans. And the father of the house had, like I said, complete control over his wife, his sons' children, everybody. Very different from we think of today when we get married and go off on our own. Back then, they were patrilocal. They moved into the groom's father's house, or if the groom's father was dead, simply into the groom's house. Oftentimes in wealthier houses, slaves would be used to raise the children. The relationship between parents and children was much more distant than how we think of even being healthy today. Perhaps some of this was because of frequent death in childbirth for women. Children would frequently often be left without mothers, so the use of slaves as wet nurses to raise children, that might be where this practice comes from. Others speculate that it was considered below the dignity of an upper-class Roman woman to have to be bothered with raising a child, so they just leave the task to the slaves. But again, in this is with upper-class families. I'm sure lower-class families didn't do that. If the mother died in childbirth, the child either died too, was left out for exposure, or perhaps an aunt or somebody else might have taken up the task of raising the child. The thing to really take away from all of this is the total power of the pater familias, who had what they call patria potestas, which means fatherly power. Potestas is legally conferred power, the same term used to describe the tribuniccio power of the emperors. In other words, it's a legal kind of authority that they can exercise. There's also the term manus, which means hand, and in this context, your hand means something that you hold on to, something that you control. So manus essentially can mean authority. And by absolute control, I'm not exaggerating. The father of the family had the legal right to beat, kill, or sell into slavery any member of his family at any time for any reason. All of the property of the family members, he also had complete control over, grandchildren included, if he was still alive when grandchildren were alive, old enough to have property themselves. This again, it's very conservative. It's a way of having one guiding hand making a decision for the family so that the family could function as one unit. In an ancient condition where the competition for resources with other families in the area could be quite brutal, this made sense. It was a survival strategy. It sounds hellish, and it was, but compared to everybody starving to death in 700 BC, this is just how they did it, and it worked into and became part of their culture's idea of how a family should work. It's also interesting to note that these laws were written down in the 12 tables. The 12 tables talk about a lot of things, but one of the things they mention is this idea of patria potestas. And the 12 tables were put down around 450 BC. So, they named their firstborn sons after themselves. It was a way of laying claim to the dignitas of the ancestor. So, we have Quintus Servilius Caepio, and he had a son named Quintus Servilius Caepio, who had a son named Quintus Servilius Caepio. The idea was basically like, if the name worked for me, it might as well work for you. Women only had one name, so you could have multiple daughters called Servilia, you'd have Servilia Majora, Servilia Minora, Servilia Tertia, which essentially Servilia Majora would mean Servilia Major, or Servilia Minora would mean Servilia Minor. You know, you got Servilia the Older, Servilia the Younger, Servilia Tertia, Servilia the Third. Not very creative, but they were laying claim to all these Servilias that had come before them, their mothers, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, their aunts, etc., etc., etc. The potestas only lapsed, the patria potestas, only lapsed when the man died or if he went insane. Now, of course, when he died, then it would go to his oldest son. In some cases, it could be voluntarily released, but that apparently was rare. In cases of insanity, the family could legally have his patria potestas removed. That was a temporary measure until he either then died or the insanity lapsed. But these are just the legal ramifications. Like our modern divorce laws don't in any real way express what it's like to live in a family today. It just tells you what is allowed and what isn't. So that's what we're looking at when we're looking at the Roman family from the sources. All we have are the laws that they wrote down. We don't have a lot of accounts of, you know, what it was like, what the boring stuff was like. Back then, if you're going to go to the bother to write something down, it's important. You're not going to write about, you know, how your wife would really like running water in the house, but you don't feel like paying for it. You know, they're not going to bother to record that sort of thing. So we don't have any window into or insight into those assets of life, which I think are the most interesting. Really, I mean, you could read about battles all day long, but what did they do after that? You know. So, usually the paterfamilias was not a tyrannical figure, although he could have been. There are examples of people being tyrants, but usually that's from the legendary past. Romans always like a good story. And these are probably things that they told their children before they went to bed so that they'd behave. You know, oh, so-and-so a few hundred years ago, well, you know what he did when his kid wouldn't shut up? He sent him over to Greece as a slave, or something. Remember Brutus killing his sons after the expulsion of the Tarquins when they were found to be part of a plot to bring back the king? As a whole, that's not likely. It's not likely that they would have been tyrannical to their families, but it did happen. Remember, the life expectancy in the ancient world wasn't very high either. The idea that a son could live to full maturity and raise a family and still have a father exercising authority over him must have been quite rare. A good exception is a guy Cicero was a lawyer for. I don't remember his name, but the guy was charged with killing his father because his father had basically parked him on a farm out in the countryside while he went off to Rome, apparently to party with the best of them, by all accounts. The prosecution said that this man was angered by this and wanted to have him murdered. Cicero was able to paint a different picture, one much more conspiratorial than that, and as a result was able to get his client off. And by the way, I'm pronouncing Cicero in English because otherwise it'd be Cicero, and I don't think anybody would know who the hell I'm talking about if I said Cicero. All C's are hard in Latin. If you want to make an S sound, use a sodding S. Also, custom came into limiting the patria potestas. Fathers wouldn't just randomly sell their children into slavery. When a father was thinking about doing something severe, it was customary to summon a family council. The decision of the family council was usually considered binding over the father, although legally, technically, he didn't have to actually obey them. It was just the social order and custom and tradition that he would. That and he would piss off everybody else in the family. So, there's always that. There always has been and always will be that. There are also certain social taboos, like beating your wife was seen as a no-no and would lose you status in society if people knew that you beat your wife, or if you sold your children into slavery. So we have to remember that even though this seems backward to us, it made sense at the time, and apparently it worked for them. And they had these limiting factors on potential abuse. So that's the Roman family. Roman women. Roman women were naturally seen as being within the domestic sphere of influence. Big surprise. And I have a bit of a warning. It's hard to study Roman women without mentioning their menfolk. Whatever status women had would have been directly related to that of their husbands or fathers. Rich women and poor women had totally different experiences, and there is no evidence and no sign whatsoever that a kitchen maid would have felt any kind of kindred spirit with a senator's wife, or vice versa. That being said, there were certain laws that pertained to all women in general. Women were required by Roman law to always be under the care of some man or another. It didn't mean they had to be escorted down the street or anything, but think about like your address. Your address would always have either your father or your husband's name on it. You couldn't just have an address that was you as a woman. That's the best analogy I can come up with. When they were born, obviously it was their father. When they married, in the old-fashioned confariato ceremony, they passed manus from their father to the manus of her husband, or if his father was still alive, then it would have been transferring the manus and potestas of her father to her father-in-law. The confariato marriage is the most ancient, and so called because they would eat a far, which is a cake broken over an altar and eaten by the bride and groom. It marked the legal transfer of manus from her father to the groom. It was the only form of Roman marriage that could not be dissolved by divorce. By the 1st century BC, it apparently had largely fallen out of practice. The kind that didn't involve this legal transfer of power were preferred by about the year 100 to 50 BC or so. Either way, a Roman woman was always under the rule of one male or another. Roman women could own property. Unlike many other Mediterranean societies, most other Mediterranean societies, in fact, Greece, for example, women weren't allowed to own property. But the Romans could. And there's a funny story, actually. There was a scam attempted by a senator's mistress. He got sick, and she tried to add herself into his will by forging in her own records a loan that she made to the senator that she could then claim when he was dead. But he got better. So, but she didn't give up. She even sued him over this loan on the pretense that it wasn't actually a forgery. She lost her case, but it's important to note that she could actually sue somebody. It was done doubtless by her menfolk on her behalf, but the point was, legally, it was all being done for her. So a woman could actually enter into a lawsuit over property from another man outside of her own family. It's kind of a schizophrenic way of thinking about it, but yeah. The dowry was given upon a marriage, but it was always considered to be the bride's property. Originally, it was probably to help with the upkeep of adding another mouth to feed back in the day when you're bringing, the patrilocal system, when the bride is going to live with the groom's family. But later on, in Roman society, it was more of a token arrangement of money. And women would apparently loan their dowries to their husbands in order to be able to bitch at them for it later. Cicero actually laments on this practice, apparently, at length, because when Cicero divorced his wife, Terentia, in 48 BC, he had considerable trouble raising the money to pay back her dowry, which, of course, he had spent in the interim. So he owed it to her. women were viewed by men in what today we'd call sexist terms. That is, they were weak, not trustworthy, more prone to emotion, being fickle. The idea comes from land ownership again. They had to keep them from having children with people outside of the family. Not that they were incestuous, but they wanted to arrange the marriages. And, because they were afraid the land would be lost to outsiders. The situation with the poor is harder to discern. They probably were more likely to have loving relationships, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they happened. In other words, the poor probably had marriages similar to the way we do today, where it's a crapshoot, essentially. Women could become rather powerful, though. Cornelia, the mother of the Gracchi, she was the daughter of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War. That's where he gets the fourth name Africanus from. She had 12 children. A woman in the 2nd century BC survived having 12 children. Oh my god. 2 of whom were the Gracchi brothers. She had lots of prominent menfolk, and her whole demeanor was considered essentially perfect. Cornelia even had a statue erected of her in her honor in a public space at public expense by decree of the Senate. She's one of the few such women we're aware of to have ever had such an honor. Augustus' daughter, the Emperor Augustus, his daughter ended up having love affairs and ended up on a small island for the rest of her life. Julia was married 3 times, and all three of the people she was married to were designated as heirs to Augustus. So, couldn't get any better than that, right? Perfectly legitimate. But she had a bunch of affairs and was also put on an island, and Augustus refused to ever countenance her return to Rome. His granddaughter did something similar and also ended up on a small island in the Tyrrhenian Sea in AD 8. Same as before, these women risked bringing in outsiders into the family line. In this case, it's a royal line of succession, but if you're a farmer with 5 yugra of land, you want to keep those 5 yugra of land in your family. You don't want to have a son from some other guy and you partition off part of the lot and then he gets married. You've essentially lost your land after a few generations. As under the more mundane circumstances, land ownership would be compromised by outsiders brought in by promiscuous women. This kind of stuff happened throughout Roman history, but we just get little bits and pieces of information. One example is the wife of the Emperor Trajan, Clatina. She seems to have orchestrated the rise of Hadrian, because Hadrian was adopted by Trajan. But if you look a little more closely, apparently the day Trajan adopted him was the day after Trajan died. That would suggest Clatina had a little something to do with it. Another note, I'm pronouncing Trajan in English because otherwise it would be Trajan. Yeah, Train. The I in Latin, if it's before a vowel, then becomes a consonant. Y, ya. Anyway. So, I'm saying Trajan. I also said Hadrian instead of Hadrio, but whatever. In the male ideal, women were basically just supposed to stay at home, tend to the children, and not cause a fuss. Pudicipia is doing just that. Pudicipia is a hard word to translate. Basically, it's a combination of modesty, chastity, fidelity, and fertility all rolled into one. Ideally, a woman should be educated enough to hold her own in a conversation, but not overly educated. They wouldn't want her getting into a shouting match with other dinner guests, or to prove all the men wrong on some important point of philosophy. That wouldn't go down well. She should be agreeable, but not overly so, of course. Basically, just think of Queen Elizabeth I. They wanted all women to be like that. I'm about to go to part 3. Did anybody have any questions about that?
We were Me and Nerys were trying to work out what the women actually did, but I think you just covered that in the last couple of minutes, Miles. It seems to be like, well, we've kind of got it down to mostly they had affairs and children. That was up to the women. They didn't really do. And if they did get into power, it was because they were sleeping with the right people. Are we about right?
Yeah, pretty much. They could exert power behind the scenes, and there are a lot of women that did that. But the men wouldn't have wanted to admit this, so they don't write it down. So we don't have a lot of evidence to talk about it much.
So pretty much the same as it is now, then.
Well, women can do things now more than they could then.
No, I meant like most of the men think that they're in charge. And they portray that they're in charge, but really, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
But we don't ever admit that, Niles, of course.
Well, I mean, the fact that you and I are even the fact that you even said that, it means that you're aware that men oftentimes aren't really in control.
No, Nerys told me to say it.
Okay. I was going to say, I think there's a lot of men today that are starting to realize that, and they're basically just becoming apathetic to it. That's another issue. But you were going to say something, Nerys?
Well, I was just pondering on that, really. I suppose by the nature of affairs, it meant that women could be quite manipulative, couldn't it, behind the scenes. I was just interested that, in the respect to other kind of civilisations, there were at least sort of one or two women of note that were really out there, as it were, but it doesn't seem as if there were any within the Roman civilization at all,
Yeah. It's kind of like a spectrum where the Greeks, the women exerted no power or influence to speak of. In Rome, women were at least allowed to work behind the scenes and own property, and they had a few things that they could use against their husbands. And then you move into the Celtic regions of Europe, you have female queens that are fully in charge, like Cartimandua, with her husband Servilius wanting to fight the Romans, and she said, "No, I'm in charge, you sit down, shut up." So.
Yeah, I suppose it's interesting that you say there wasn't, the Celtic thing is the thing I know most about. There were very much where men would separate and women would separate and do their thing and exert themselves as groups. The Romans don't seem to have had that, really, from what you've said.
Mm. Well, they did have separate roles, and just because the men, weren't under the same rules as the women, they still had expectations. They were expected to do what their ancestors did. If your father was a senator, you were going to become a senator. If you're not a senator, you're a failure. They couldn't just do whatever they wanted. Their lives were kind of pre-decided for them based on their family's history. And they just keep towing the same line, and whoever slips or falters, well, you're the one who ruined the family, because everybody that's going to come after you, well, we don't have money anymore, or whatever mistake you had made, is going to have consequences for your lineage. Yeah, very long-term approach that they had to looking at this.
Yeah. God, they can't have been very happy, can they, really?
Yeah. Well, they're very angry. The chariot races and the Roman arena, and later the Colosseum. This is a funny little fact. There were more people that died in the circus than in the Colosseum, because the chariot racing was extremely dangerous. You were allowed to have a guy on the chariot to stab the dude on the other chariot. That was part of the race, was just fighting each other, as opposed to actually, out racing each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's crazy. Yeah, it's very testosterone fueled.
Yeah, extremely. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Miles. Yeah. I was just trying to grasp onto straws that there may have been one amazing female that had something to say, but obviously not.
The biggest female I could think of in Roman history isn't even a Roman. It would actually be Cleopatra.
Yes.
Yeah, she kept Caesar from. The thing is, Cleopatra's father had left in his will Egypt to the Romans. So legally, when Caesar came in and met Cleopatra, he owned her country. But she was able to convince him to let her stay in power. And later on, when he was assassinated, she threw all of her chips in with Mark Antony. And then in the Battle of it's escaping me right now. But anyway, when Mark Antony lost the sea battle against Agrippa and Octavian, that's when she committed suicide.
Yeah, pretty impressive, really, to come into another civilization like that and lay the law down, really, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Cleopatra was one of the Ptolemies, and the Ptolemies were, after Alexander the Great died, his emperor was divided into 3 regions by his generals. The Ptolemies took Egypt. So the Ptolemies were Greek rulers that came into Egypt and ruled for about 250 years up till the middle of the 1st century BC.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the historical issues I'd have to take with Paul Mooney, but I don't expect anybody to know who Paul Mooney is.
No, I don't, I'm afraid, Miles. I don't know how you retain the amount of information that you do.
Well, Paul Mooney's a comedian, and he has one of his comedy specials is called Cleopatra was black and so was Jesus. But anyway. Well,
Jesus would have had dark skin, though, wouldn't he, Miles?
Yeah, he would have been Jewish, like the people in Palestine are today. That's
olivey-coloured skin. He wouldn't have been like a white dude, right, with blonde hair, would he? Like, they portray him.
Yeah, neither would he have been a black African.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I know it's not in style anymore to say this, but there are the anthropologists do actually specify black Africans instead of North Africans, Egyptians and people in North Africa being more similar to people in and around the Mediterranean and East Asia, Southwest Asia, around the Levant and Fertile Crescent, Iraq, Iran, that kind of area. Anyway. Well, I'll be honest, I didn't... This is going to end a little earlier than I thought, but whatever. Part 3 here is a short one. I just want to talk a little bit about the year without a summer. It's gotten me thinking, I don't know what the weather's been like for you guys, but we've had a very mild spring, and it's been taking its sweet time warming up here this season. I don't know about you guys over in Britain.
Yeah, it's not really started yet, Miles. We've had a couple of warm days. But if we get 4 sunny days in a row, we class that as summer.
Yeah. But is that just because of your famous? Is that because of your famous lovely British weather, or just because of unusual circumstances?
I'd say it changed. I mean, although our weather's always been quite changeable, we did used to have somewhat of a summer, and now, I mean, it's been really cold, hasn't it, Bob? I mean, we did have a sort of a spring, and then the temperatures just dropped again. And in fact, we had a frost. Was it about a week and a half ago? Did you have some snow up there, didn't you?
I had a hailstorm here and snow. There wasn't a lot of it, but 4 or 5 days ago, something like that.
Yeah, we've had that. We've had hail. We've literally had, like, in one day, rain and then hail and then cloud, and then we've had a few days of that, and then sun come out at about 5 o'clock on the evening. That's why we were all joking around that's when Harp finishes work for the day, and then they go home and the sun comes out.
Yeah. Well.
So yeah, really, Miles, you could say that the seasons are very slow to come this year. Very slow to come, but it's been pretty similar for the last few years. Potatoes had a major problem last year because there wasn't enough water, enough rain. Which is crazy, but it was cold and windy when it wasn't, an overcast. Really been overcast. So yeah, if you see the sun now and a bit of blue sky, you get out in it in the UK, Miles.
Oh yeah. Last spring we actually had a bit of an Indian summer where it got quite warm in March early, then it cooled a little bit, and then got warm about as usual at the beginning of May. But this got me thinking recently about the year without a summer, which was on April 10th of 1815. Mount Tambora exploded in the Indonesian islands. It was the largest explosion of a volcano we've ever documented, and as far as we could tell, it's the biggest explosion since 1300 years up to that point. The next year, that coincided with a solar minimum, and it was kind of a perfect storm of astrological and geological conditions that actually lowered the Earth's average temperature by a little over half a degree centigrade, and led to some of the weirdest looking sunsets and sunrises that have ever been seen. There was brown snow that fell in Hungary and red snow that fell in Italy from the chemicals in the atmosphere actually ended up staining the snow brown and red. And I have a bit of a quote here from an excerpt from Wikipedia, and I know Wikipedia sucks, but bear with me, I'm on a time restraint here, and I spent a lot of time doing everything that I've just recited up to this point, so bear with me. The conditions during the Northern Hemisphere summer of 1816 were the result of the largest observed eruption in recorded human history, one during which global temperatures decreased by an average of 0.53 degrees centigrade. The related human deaths were reported to be about 75,000. That's a ridiculously low estimate, by the way. The importance of volcanic eruptions during this anomaly, specifically the eruption of Mount Tambora, can't be overlooked. It's the most significant factor in this important climate anomaly across the globe. While there were other eruptions during the year 1814, Tambora was basically the biggest one, and it erupted a 45-kilometer-long column of ash and debris into the upper atmosphere, eclipsing all other volcanoes by at least one order of magnitude. In other words, it was 200% bigger than the next largest volcano that had occurred. There were actually 4 eruptions in 1814, and then there was the one big-ass one in 1815 with Tambora. All of this coincided with the sun coming to a minimum output of energy. Apparently, sunspots could actually be observed on Earth with the naked eye. The sun was... You could actually look at the sun. I'm sure it wasn't a good idea, but you could do it. That's weird. That's going to make things a lot colder. And because of all this bad weather at the time, I don't know about the rest of the world, but it's partly responsible for the westward migration of Americans out of New York State and New England and Pennsylvania west into the Ohio Valley and points west and what we call the Old Northwest Territory. So the year without a summer is real. It did happen, and fortunately, I don't think what we're experiencing right now is quite that bad. There were killing frosts in Europe as south as Rome in July that summer. They didn't have any crops the whole year.
Wow, that's mad. Then in July, frost in July.
Yeah, and it started snowing by late August. Winter just set in by the end of August.
'Cause all the crops would have been out then. So yeah, it would have been devastating. You said the people moved in America. So what? They were moving inland.
Yeah, the beginning of the 1800s, most of the American population was still about 100 miles off of the coast, and states like Kentucky, Tennessee, the midpoint between the East Coast and the Mississippi River was beginning to be settled by people. And when New England had this horrible winter in 1816, of course, New England's the furthest north, so they're going to feel the effects of the year without a summer more drastically than people in Georgia down further south. So they started to move out of, desperation is usually the prime motivator in getting people to pick up and move their whole families somewhere else that you've never even been to before. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of moving, but just on my own to another country. I think that's through desperation, to be honest.
What country do you have in mind?
I'm looking at Spain. I've seriously looked at Spain.
Spain?
Spain, yeah, or Morocco. I'm not certain yet.
Why in the world would you want to move to Morocco?
I don't know yet. Like I say, don't know why. I've got to go and look at it first. I'll go and look at it.
It'd certainly be warmer and sunnier, I guess.
Yeah, I don't really suffer from arthritis because I use medical cannabis. But in the winter when it gets cold, over last winter, I can't afford the amount of medicine that it costs here, miles. I just can't do that, so I do need to move to a warmer climate. And if I can go to a warmer climate where I can get my medicine, then I win hands down.
Right.
So I don't know if I'd lose permanently. Like I say, I've not made a final decision on it, but it is the same reason, man, through desperation. You're quite right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you have to. It's a gamble to pick up and move whatever period of history we're talking about. So your situation at home needs to be worse than what you predict the odds of success or failure are with moving. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't think it's got to that stage, but yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can really go anywhere. As a Westerner in Europe, there's not you're not. It's not going to be too difficult wherever you go, really.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. Just depends on how much money you have, really.
Like I say, it's unlikely you're going to starve.
Right.
So the level of desperation, I suppose, is massively different to what we go through in the West now and what those people would have gone through.
Well, there's also the degree of tolerance. What we grow up thinking is a comfortable living and what they grew up 200 years ago thinking was a comfortable living are two different things. So I guess, for us, if you don't have internet access in your neighborhood, that would be an intolerable enough condition to warrant moving. Especially if your career involves using the internet. Something as trivial as that.
A mate of mine, Fell, made the analogy of the Roman slave in the UK and the modern day living in the UK. That the Roman slaves, they didn't have to pay for their housing. They got free housing, they got free water, they got free food, they got free clothing, they got a bit of change, a bit of pocket money at the end of the week, and they went down to the local football arena or amphitheatre and had a bit of entertainment. And if they were breeding, they got 2 days off. Of course, you may, as long as you got a benevolent master, and then you were fine. It was a really good life. In the 21st century in the UK, we haven't got benevolent masters, and we have to pay for our housing, our water, our food, even our own entertainment. Yeah. And if you are breeding, then it costs you more. So Yeah, we've really, you know, the slaves of the 21st century are really hard pushed.
Yeah. You actually get taxed higher if you have children?
Well, you have to pay for the children. They do give you a housing benefit.
Yeah, we're allowed to deduct.
A child benefit. Yeah. You do get a child benefit.
Right.
But Nerisse will tell you it's not really something you could bring a child upon, child benefit.
I think I get about 70 quid for all 3 kids. It goes down. It's the same amount for 2, and then if you have a third one, the payment gets less. They're trying to put you off. I think it goes lower the more children you have. Free. Yeah.
Wow.
But I mean, it's kind
and that's a month? 70 a month?
Yeah. Oh God, I can't remember what it is now. Yeah, I think that's a month. But then you also get child tax credits now. But don't ask me how they work that out. They send you this thing, the way they've worked it out.
Well, the answer to how they work is probably that they don't.
No. Well, I think basically it's just this, isn't it? The cost of living's too expensive. No one can afford it. So even if you're not on actual benefits as such, you still need your income supplemented because it's all out of balance. So to keep the economy moving, they have to literally supplement everyone. Otherwise, it just would fall apart the next day. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Well, I know if you immigrate either to the United States or Mexico, your money would go a lot further, just because of the value of the pound over the dollar.
Yeah, well, the pound and the dollar and nearly all of them, I don't know, it looks like I mean, it's something I used to watch, Miles. You know, we're doing a little bit of travelling. If I was, I used to keep my eye on the currencies. And if the currency went weak, and I thought, I'm going there, I'll get some. But the pound against the dollar sadly moved. Few cents. Literally, maybe from $1.49 to maybe $1.52 to the pound. They might as well be the same currency.
Well, they
actually are, aren't they? I forgot. Yeah, they are actually the same currency.
$1.50 to a pound, that's a considerable difference.
No, it's only fluctuated 3 cents in the last 12 months.
Yeah, I know, but there's about a 49 to 51 cent difference either way. That's considerable.
Oh my God, the dollar's got really strong. There used to be $2 to the pound.
Well, $2 to the pound mean the pound's stronger than the dollar.
Excuse me? No, you got this the other way around.
Oh yeah, you're right.
The pound is stronger than the dollar.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Well, whatever.
It's one of the strongest.
Either way, it's a hell of a lot stronger than the peso. So, if you want to go to Mexico, your money's going to go a lot further.
Yeah, or India, and you can get rupees, something like 80 rupees in a pound. You know.
Is it still a big gap? It was years ago when I went to India. What's the difference now?
It's about 80.
I think it's about 55 on the dollar.
Yeah, it's about 80 for us.
Yeah. When I was there, it was about 45 rupees for a dollar. Yeah, you could. I could have bought a new Hyundai for I think $400.
It's really a mad place. How long ago was it since you were there, Nerisse?
It was 96, 97. I was there. I went for 3 months.
Oh.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Can I put in a request for another break? I'm out of lemonade.
Yep, certainly.
Cool. I'll be right back.
A little bit. What do you want? A few seconds or?
A minute or so.
Right. Let me find you 1 minute, Miles. Have I got a minute? Yes, Darkcity Hackers jingle.
They said we could not do it. They said it wasn't possible. But we did it. We created a free radio station. to bring the people together and spread an alternative message from the mainstream. They tried to silence us. They tried to hack us. But we carried on. You cannot silence the truth. You cannot enslave freedom. You cannot stop a good idea. You cannot stop Dark City Radio. The crew is now bigger and stronger than ever before. We will not be kept off the airwaves. We will continue. This is not our radio. This is your radio. This is Dark City Radio.
This is your Dark City. This is your Dark City.
This is your Dark City.
This is your Dark City. This is your Dark City.
This is your Dark City Radio.
Well, here's the last segment, part 4. Brief explanation of the difference between a dialect, a pidgin, and a Creole with languages. When I'm saying pidgin, I'm not talking about the chattery disease bag bird. I'm talking about P-I-D-G-I-N. It's essentially a very stripped-down basic form of a language that we would use for trading purposes. And, all right, starting with dialects. Dialects are, by their definition, mutually intelligible. Sometimes they could be considerably different, like the way Cornwallish or not Cornwallish. Cornwallish can be argued to be its own language. It's either an extreme dialect or a very, very closely related language. But the one I'm thinking of is Cockney. Cockney is a dialect. You can understand somebody talking in a Cockney accent, you know, Mary Poppins, Victorian chimney sweep. You could, in a movie or something, you can understand what they're saying. They just kind of talk funny. Then there's the idea of diaglossia. Diaglossia is essentially it means two tongues in one mouth. Basically, you have a high or a formal way of talking, and then you have a low or an informal way of talking, and you can kind of switch between the two. Some languages have more of an emphasis on this, where you'll basically have completely different words for something all the time. English does have this. You ever thought about it? If you're a farmer and you kill a pig and you eat that meat for dinner, you don't say you're sitting down to eat pig, you're sitting down to eat pork. For some reason, we use the French-based word for what's on our plate that we're eating inside a nice heated house with 4 walls and a roof, but the shuffling little animal out in the field, that's called a pig. Pig is from the Old English. Same thing with beef, venison, poultry. Another high-low thing we have in English is children and kid. Children is usually more formal than saying kid. A few other examples like that, but we don't have too much of it in our language. And diaglossia can affect dialects, where if you have a low way of speaking that becomes much more different from the high way of talking, the formal way of talking, that low speak can eventually turn into a dialect. And if those people go settle a colony on the other side of the planet, maybe that dialect will turn into its own language. It could happen. Now, pigeons. Pigeons are not complete languages. Nobody goes their whole life speaking nothing but a pidgin language. A pidgin language, like the Chinese would use what we call, the name pigeon comes from a place in China, Pidyon, I think. Anyway, the Chinese, for the longest time, didn't want to have trade with the West. So when they did allow trade, they'd have the Westerners stay on their ships in the harbor, and they'd come out to them and they'd trade or whatever, and they would speak this kind of pidgin English, which is just a very basic form of it, and I'm going to have an example a little later here. Pigeons have very small vocabulary, maybe around 150 to 300 words, and they relied extremely heavily on context. Like I said, they're used for basic trading purposes. In the late 1700s, Russian traders would spend the summer in Norway, and they'd spend 2 or 3 months trading. The Russians would bring timber, and the Norwegians would bring fish. Now, Russian and Norwegian are two very different languages, although they're both Indo-European. So they're from the same language family, but they're still quite different. And yeah, you could use the sign languages like the Native Americans used to use for trading purposes, but these aren't full sign languages the way we think of American Sign Language or European Sign Language for the deaf or hard of hearing. So sign language wasn't enough. They needed to come up with something. But neither one was going to sit down and learn Russian or Norwegian completely. So they created this cross between the two languages. Linguists call it Russia Norse, but they would have called it Moya Patoya, which in the pidgin meant me and yours. One phrase from Russia Norse was, there's a dog on my ship, which came out, Sabuku Paboya Skip. Po is a kind of everything preposition. It means at, on, with, both in Norwegian and in Russian. Skib, S-K-I-B like boy, is cognate with our word ship, and skib meant ship in Norwegian. Moya is Russian, but that's okay. Europeans are used to an M plus a vowel, me, mine, moi, to mean my, so Moya is no confusion there. There are no tense markings, and there are no articles. Articles are the, a, and an. Norwegian does have articles, but Russian does not. Remember Rocky and Bullwinkle, let's go get squirrel. So, no articles. This is just enough for basic conversation, as you would most likely have spent the majority of the summer talking with your own countrymen. It also seems like, from the list of vocabulary, that there was a lot of alcohol involved in these settings, and that probably had an impact on communication as well. There are about 300 words total, which is typical of a pidgin language. There's another idea called circumlocution. There's an example that Dr. John McWhorter, who, if you ever want to Google him, he's got several videos. He's awesome. He really, really knows. He's done a lot of research on the study of Creole languages. Now, he had a student once come up with a list of words so that he could basically invent a pidgin language and try it out with the students in the class and see what came about it. And one of the word they had a word go and they had a word bag, but they didn't have a word for car. So one of the students started saying go bag for a car, and eventually it was cute and it caught on. So in the pidgin, in order to express car, they would say go bag. Very basic, like I said, bare minimum for communication, and it's not a full language. Somebody speaking a pidgin has a mother tongue that they grew up talking. That's a full, nuanced language. Native Americans, as recently as the 1960s, were depicted, or hell, the 70s and 80s, were depicted as speaking pidgin forms of English. Tonto from the Lone Ranger spoke in this classic stereotypical American pidgin. Hollywood was pretty big on that. That's how they would have spoken up until the 1800s, before they were annihilated/assimilated. Heap was used to mean very, so, heap big teepee did mean very big teepee, and that was something they would have actually said in their pidgin use of the English language. There's a quote from an Amerindian woman insulting a white man. Basically, it was a cavalry guy who was ambushing or rounding up a bunch of natives into a reservation, but this is just too good. The woman says, "You silly, you weak, you baby hands, no catch horse, no kill buffalo, no good, but for sit still, read book." The meaning comes across quite clearly, even though it's this very basic use of the language. You notice there's no verb to be in any of these sentences. She doesn't say you are silly. It's just you silly. You know what that means. You don't need to be reminded of the fact that silly exists. That's what the verb to be means. And another thing is, why is a pidgin not a Creole? Creoles are what we think of as a full language. Totally nuanced. You could express as much as in a Creole language as you could in any other language. That you can't do with a pidgin. They could be used from cradle to grave for all facets of life. Pidgins can't be used like that. Speakers of pidgin languages also speak another language as their base language or mother tongue. Usually the pidgin is used to communicate with other groups. Eventually a pidgin can become a Creole if enough people speak it. Examples of this come from the Caribbean, when slaves would escape from the plantations and run off into the jungle and found their own communities. Since a lot of times these guys would be, this is a common practice. I mean, the Romans did it. I would imagine all slaving peoples do this if they have half a brain cell. You take people from different countries that don't speak the same language and make them work together, so it's harder for them to revolt against you. If they don't know what the hell the other guy's saying, how are they going to plan a revolt? So you'd have West African slaves in the Caribbean. Yes, their languages are similar in that area, just like Western European languages are similar and from the same language family, but they were still different. They weren't mutually intelligible. That being said, they were speaking these pidgin forms of English, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and when they would escape the plantations, it was this pidgin language that was their lingua franca. That was the way they were able to communicate with one another. Over time, because those aren't full languages, they became full languages out of necessity. And within a few generations, the pidgin isn't. There's no sign of that anymore. Now there's this Creole being spoken, where you have a borrowing of, a lot of times you have words from a European language with a grammatical structure similar to how their native languages were. Sometimes this means they put the verb at the beginning. Sometimes they put the verb at the end. If you don't know, English is considered what they call an SVO language, subject, verb, object. Billy walked to the store. I don't say Billy to the store walked. That would be putting the verb at the end. German does that. Some Romance languages like to do that. Not all the time, but sometimes. Latin certainly did it a lot. Hebrew. One of the big differences between ancient Hebrew and the modern Hebrew now spoken in the state of Israel is that biblical Hebrew actually has the verb first. It's a VSO, verb, subject, object. So Billy walked to the store, walked Billy to the store would be the if you not using Hebrew words, but just the Hebrew word order of verb, subject, object. The weirdest of these permutations is having the object come first, and object, verb, subject, or object, subject, verb. You usually only see it with indigenous groups. There are some out of the Amazon where they actually put the object first. So, again, Billy walked to the store with the object first would be to the store, Billy walked. When people of that group come out and enter civilization, I guess the first thing they have to get used to is the fact that people in civilization talk backwards. So, examples of Creole. In the United States, we usually think of the French Creole of Louisiana, and a lot of people say Creole thinking that's the only one, but there's hundreds of Creoles around the world. There's Suriname. In Suriname, there's a Creole. I think is Tuk Pilsen or Tuk Pissen, but that I didn't actually write down. So can't talk about that much more than I already have. Yeah. That's about it. Did anybody have any other questions about any of that stuff?
No, man. All good stuff, Miles. All good stuff. Pretty well rounded us again. Good stuff, man. Plenty to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the construction of language. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And the similarities between languages as well. I was amazed when I went to Italy how much, even as someone who's not very good at picking up languages, you know, because of the Latin and things like that, you know, you can understand. And I've also looked a bit at ancient Welsh, which is quite interesting, but very unfathomable.
Yeah, well, even modern Welsh, I mean, my hat's off to you if you could learn that language after the age of 3.
I know a little bit of Welsh. Eastalawa is sit down.
Eastalawa means sit down?
Yeah, Eastalawa, sit down. And Paned is kettle, put the kettle on. So them are the things I could do.
That's useful. Yeah.
Yeah, basically. Put the kettle on and sit down. But I believe...
The stuff I learned was when I was studying the Druidry, so that it's dialects that they don't even speak anymore, so it's not massively useful unless you're doing some kind of ritual. And I learned some Korean, because when I did Taekwondo, you have to learn all the moves in Korean. So that if you know, it's quite good actually. You learn all the moves in Korean, so if you go and study anywhere else in the world, whoever's teaching you, you all know what you're talking about, so which is pretty cool, really.
Right. Yeah. I think Welsh might even be a verb-first language, but I don't remember.
Yeah, another one is there's no J, is there, in the Welsh alphabet?
Okay.
No.
And Jones is one of the most common Welsh names you can get.
Do they still make a J sound? They just spell it differently?
No, it was the English. They couldn't pronounce it, so they just called them Jones.
Oh.
Seriously,
Okay.
that's what they're like.
No, I can believe that. Yeah. Like I said, Yucatan is supposed to mean what? I don't understand you. Oh, okay. I guess they call it the Yucatan. We're going to call it Yucatan now. You know. Remember the story of the kangaroo?
No. Yucatan kangaroo. No.
When the English went into Australia, they asked the Aborigines what they called a kangaroo, and they said they looked at the native guy, you know, white guy gets off a boat, lands in Australia, sees this native guy, sees a kangaroo, he points to the kangaroo and says in English, "What do you call that creature?" Native guy says, "Kangaroo," which means, "What are you saying?" "Oh, they call it a kangaroo. How about that, buddies? All right, we're going to call it a kangaroo now. Write that one down." I mean, what did you expect? You asked him in English. He doesn't know English any more than you know whatever the hell his language is.
When I was in Australia, Miles, on a few occasions, I actually said, and I was joking, I said these Aborigine people just made these names up to confuse. Because, you know, it's ridiculous. It really is, you know, the jip, jip, jabba, jabba, jip, jip. It's like, what? Hotel. All right. Cheers. Hotel. So, yeah, it's a strange language.
Have you ever heard of the click languages in Africa?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The only other place in the world where there exists a click language is apparently one subdialect that's only spoken among mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law of an Aborigine tribe in Australia. They have a click. Nowhere else in the world are there clicks.
Well, didn't know that.
And also, some of those Khoisan languages in the Kalahari Desert. I always say Calamari Desert. I'm retarded. Kalahari Desert, not the squid. Fried and delicious. they actually have 4 or 5 different kinds of clicks. So the type of click you're using is like a consonant. It's like the difference between a D, a T, a B, and a C or something. So it completely changes the meaning of the word if you don't get it right.
Yeah, I keep trying to remember, was it the Latin ones where A becomes E becomes I? Is that right? Have I got that right still?
Yeah. Well, A was ah, and then in English it went ah, A, and then E in Latin was A, and then in English became A, E. Yeah, and then I was E, became I. It's so confusing because our names for them are different. You know,
yeah, I know the way you explained it though. I got it. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I could now explain it to someone else. But the way you explained it on the last show, Miles, I got it. Definitely, I got it. I can hear it now.
Yeah. And Vosto was the one who told me that we don't say "oh" the way they do. We say "oh," although we usually don't think about it. Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Because there's a place here, some gardens, and they're called. We all say Martineau round here, and someone who runs them was saying they don't know why people from this area say that when it should be Martineau, and we all say Martineau. G-A-U, yeah.
Oh yeah, well, I mean French, of course.
Mm.
You know, in the South we have a lot of Beauregard streets that are pronounced Beauregard. Yeah.
Mm.
Anyway. Of course, we also have Cairo, Ohio. It's spelled Cairo, like Egypt, but they pronounce it Cairo.
Mm.
Yeah. I've known somebody with the last name Thames that pronounced it Thames. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard that
Yeah,
one.
my surname now, my father changed it years ago, but my surname now is Haydon, but pronounced Hayden. Although it's spelt with an O, it's pronounced with an E.
Yeah, yeah. And that's because the way we talk, it's easier to pronounce it that way. You'd have to go to effort to say "Hey Don." Yeah. You know, Hayden is just easier to pronounce with our accent.
You slip into things, don't you? Because I know my mum and dad intended my name to be Nyrese, but so I suppose I've corrupted it myself because I pronounce it Nerese.
Yeah,
My father had he had. I'm saying he had. It sounds like he's dead, doesn't he? And he's not. Before he changed his name, well, his name's Franklin Harry, and his surname was Holy Land. So I thought that was a really nice name, Franklin Harry Holy Land. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
I guess today, if you have a last name of Holy Land and you book an airline flight, they're going to look at you a little funny.
Yeah, especially if you're a white guy.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah. And he is. My dad is, you know. It's really...
Yeah, I figured. Very interesting. Well, does anybody have any suggestions that I should do another show on? Any topics you guys are interested in hearing about? Historical, you know?
I would, yeah. The Grey families, they're one of them. I've looked at. That'd be interesting to get somebody like yourself look at them. Lady Grey.
Is that Grey, G-R-E-Y, or G-R-E-I-G-H, or something like that?
Lady Grey, Queen for a Day. I think it's... Oh, I'm not gonna, I'd have to have a look to be sure on the spelling, Miles, I don't know. Okay. But yeah, Lady Grey, she was a queen for a day. And much more than that, they were local, her ancestors were local to me. I don't know much more about her than that.
Does she have anything to do with the tea?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't think it's anything to do with the Earl Grey. But I don't know. I really don't know, Miles. So I know it's a bit of a loose cannon.
No, that's great.
That's
I'll look into it.
I'm really also interested in the gentleman who was is he called? Oh, now there's a few of them locally. I get the names mixed up. But he was the Black Knight, the real Black Knight. Not the happy-go-lucky man that went and rescuing damsels. He was quite a tyrant. And again, he was supposedly was a local man. We still have the Black Knight pageant and stuff to this day. So, which is a bit of a weird thing, really. This man dresses up in armour and goes and threatens people with his sword around the market ground. So, not a lot's changed, really. Huh?
I was just thinking that.
That's not.
We're all out of time, I think, now, Miles. We're about done.
Okay. Well, thanks for all your help.
Oh, and hemp. Barry's just thrown in there last minute. Hemp.
I could talk about hemp.
And Sky People.
Sky People?
Yeah, have you ever heard of them? I saw some documentaries about them years ago. They were supposed to be a group of peoples that they found in Africa, in jungles. They found sort of in caves, and they were really tall people, and there were tales that they were white and they had blonde hair. They called them the Sky People. I can't remember any more details than that. It's a little bit vague. I'm sure it was the Amazon. Yeah.
Well, the Amazon's not in Africa.
Oh yeah, I can't. It was a long time ago.
I think I know what you're talking about. In the high Andes, there were mummies that were found up there, but there's also mummies of Caucasians in western China in the Gobi Desert. I can't remember their names, the name of those peoples, but yeah, that's from about 1000 BC. And they even spoke a Indo-European language that there are ancient Buddhist Sanskrit accounts that actually wrote down some of the words of that language, and that's how we know about it. I could talk about that next time.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Okay.
Put facts to my vagueness, Miles, please.
Sure.
Say good night then, and I'll drop the server.
Alright, thank you. Wale, Tay. Welcome to the show.
What show is that?
Welcome to the show.
I'm trying to connect now.
Unable to connect. If you have an internet connection, go fuck yourself, because it doesn't matter.